Welcome everybody to this ITS webinar on tracking and tracing apps. My name is Erik Bolin, and soon you will meet the whole panel. We will reconvene very soon here with a very exciting agenda and very excellent speakers. And I would like to start right away with giving the floor to ITS Chair Steven Schmidt, who will say some words about ITS and the role of this seminar, and then onward to the co-moderator Jörg Schenschi, who will also explain the agenda, and then we have the number of excellent speakers that we will welcome. Thank you very much, and over to you, Steven.
Thank you, Erik. Hello and welcome to everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for investing your time and your energy and your ideas with us. Two big thank yous in particular to those in challenging time zones, to our friends on the west coast of North America who are in their pajamas because it's 5 a.m. local, and to our friends throughout East Asia and Asia Pacific who are also in their pajamas potentially because it is 9 p.m. or even much later. Big shout out to our friends at Waseda University who are attending en masse this evening. We have a very interesting event for you today. We've brought together more than 150 thoughtful individuals, both speakers and participants, spanning 27 countries and every continent on Earth other than the Antarctic. We've come together today to discuss the very important and timely topic of tracing and tracking apps in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like the pandemic itself, our experience with contact tracing and tracking apps is new and evolving. Our insights are likewise new and evolving. The entire world is learning on the job, so to speak, during this pandemic. Against that backdrop, it's useful to think of today's panel discussion as a sort of battlefield report, sharing early insights, lessons, and challenges from the field. The definitive textbook has not yet been written. That is a task for later. You will hear today from a panel of expert voices drawn from across the globe, sharing their perspectives, their encouragement, their lessons, their warnings, and drawing on a really interesting and diverse disciplinary background, including epidemiology, privacy, telecommunications regulation, technology, and more, and diverse institutional settings, universities, government, industry. I'd like to share a few observations with you as a framing device for our conversation. We know that public health outcomes during this pandemic, life and death itself, are highly sensitive to the quality, the character, and the pace of government responses. Rapid and thoughtfully conceived government responses can save lives. Slow, poorly conceived responses cost lives. We are gathered here today precisely because of this shared sense of both possibility and peril as we look at COVID tracking and tracing apps. We should be wary of single correct answers. Different countries bring different assets, attributes, and practices to the fight against COVID, whether that is technology, law enforcement, strong public health systems, prior experience with flus, high social discipline and conformity, high trust, early action, to list a few potential assets in this fight. In their own ways, Taiwan, South Korea, Germany, and New Zealand can all be characterized as public health successes, but reached in very, very different ways. There is no single right answer. It is possible to have strong public health outcomes with tracking apps or without. South Korea and Taiwan illustrate a technology-led approach to world-leading public health outcomes, whereas Vietnam and Slovakia, as examples, demonstrate strong public health outcomes without the widespread use of tracking and tracing applications. On the question of app adoption, each nation will exhibit its own particular calculus around the balance of rights between the rights of the collectivity and the rights of the individual, around the relationship of privacy to other societally important goals, including public health. Each nation will likewise have its own legal traditions and particular forms of government. This social context will condition and color the adoption of tracking and tracing applications. Seeing apps in context is therefore very important. Apps should not be seen as silver bullets operating alone to provide rather they must operate in conjunction with a comprehensive public health system and complement existing systems of traditional contact tracing. We should resist the pull of technological utopianism in favor of a richer and more studied view of technology within particular social contexts. And while there are no silver bullets, apps still have promise. Even at low levels of adoption, these apps can offer significant potential benefits. One state of Washington study suggests that if 15% of the population uses an app that notified them of exposure to an infected person, infections would be reduced by 8% and deaths by 6%. So a significant potential benefit even at a low adoption rate. Another study suggests that if 56% of the population uses a contact tracing app and subsequently follows testing and quarantine protocols, that alone may be sufficient to contain CV-19. So, but the literature in this area is very, very emergent and it's early days, and hence we are together. I'd like to do two more things before handing it over. Tell you a little bit about the International Telecommunications Society, ITS, and share a few thank yous. So we are gathered together at an event convened under the banner of the International Telecommunications Society. So we'll spend a moment talking about ITS. So ITS has been convening conversations like this one for 34 years, since 1986. And we've been doing this all over the globe, mostly in person, but now online, where we are discussing the most pressing issues in global communications policy, because we know in our hearts that rigorous and thoughtful dialogue undertaken in a spirit of friendship across countries, across cultures, across disciplines, has the capacity to change the world. And today we've gathered 27 countries and every continent together for such a conversation. We're very much animated by a spirit of friendship and a belief that if we can come together in a place beyond the bonds and claims and limits of language and history and blood and tribe and come together first and foremost as friends, then everything else becomes possible. We can be in dialogue together, we can create new knowledge and new insights, and if shared and acted on, this new knowledge and this new insight can drive new policies and new practices and in turn lead to new outcomes. So in a genuine and fundamental sense, we have the capacity to change the world together in these conversations. Finally, some thank yous. So first of all, to our speakers, we have a great event and a great collection of speakers today. You're busy and accomplished people in your fields. We're very fortunate that you're sharing your time and expertise with us today, so thank you very, very much. To the organizer, Georg, so this amazing event has been put together by my ITS board colleague, Dr. Georg Serenci. Georg is one of the most connected people in European communications, and we're very lucky to have benefited from his goodwill, his vision, and his vast Rolodex. Thank you, Georg. Our academic host is Chalmers University and my ITS board colleague, Eric Bolin. Thank you for your ceaseless generosity to ITS and to the world, and thank you for making this event possible today as the academic host. Our corporate members at ITS are crucial as well. ITS accomplishes all of its work on the basis of volunteer efforts and volunteer contributions. But our corporate members make possible what we do around the world, thoughtful companies that operate in the communication sectors across the globe and make these events possible. So a warm thank you to them. And finally, to everyone here. My last thank you is the most important one. Thanks for joining us. Please join in the conversation today. And thank you for everything. Let's have a great conversation together.
So now I turn over the floor to Georg, and maybe did you want to continue to have slides shown, Georg, or do you want to be in full person?
No, I have no slides, but can you please present the speaker slide again, because I'm going to introduce the speakers. Thank you. Yeah, also a warm welcome from my side. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. My name is Georg Serenci, and I'm grateful for the very kind introduction Stephen already gave. We have a very interesting speaker lineup for today. Professor Sogabe, he's professor of constitutional law at Kyoto University. I hope he showed up in the meantime, but maybe there is an issue somehow because I haven't seen him yet. The next speaker will be Bronwyn Howell. She's at the Victoria University of Wellington School of Management. Stephen Schmidt, you have already seen as in his role as ITS chairman. He is Vice President Telecom Policy and Chief Regulatory Legal Counsel at TELUS Communications. Rosa Barcelo is the co-chair of the Square Patent Box Global Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice. And then we have Amélie Desvaux-Larrive. She's epidemiologist at the Complexity Science Hub at the VetMed University Vienna. We have Christian Fritsch. He's data analytics business developer. And finally, another Christian Winkelhofer, Managing Director, Public Service Austria at Accenture. So this is our great speaker lineup here. And I will organize as the moderator of this session, the 2 rounds of discussion. So 2 rounds of interventions from the individual speakers, and that would lay the ground for the discussion, for the Q&A. May I also add here that the Q&A will then, we have, so to say, after conference Q&A possibility as well via email, but Eric will explain that later on when we open the Q&A. So my first question is whether we have Professor Sogabe here or not. Eric, have you seen him?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, so then we will skip his part, and I will go directly to Bronwyn. And Bronwyn, I kindly ask you to provide us a comparison of Australia's COVID Safe and New Zealand's NC COVID Tracer. What are the important takeaways? What are the challenges? What could we learn from that experience?
Well, thank you, Georg, and good day to everyone. I'll just now share my slides with you. Just noting that this work that I'm sharing today is joint work with Petrus Pokita at the University of South Africa, so it truly is an international take on the issue of COVID tracing apps. The context of what's happened in Australia and New Zealand is that both countries in the face of the pandemic opted to go for an elimination strategy with the disease. So this led to economic and social lockdowns much stronger in New Zealand than in Australia. But the consequence was that by May 9, 2020, both countries appeared to be succeeding in the elimination strategy. just to clarify that elimination is not the complete removal of the disease, but what it is that it gets to a stage where there's no community-based transmission, that with managed borders, the countries are able to manage people coming in with testing, isolation and quarantine, that any new instances of the virus are managed in that isolation environment and don't get into the community for community transmission. But because none of those processes are perfect, in May 2020, both countries introduced smartphone-based apps for COVID tracing for their systems. They both introduced these apps in Australia prior to the lockdown easing, and in New Zealand after the lockdown had started easing. The purpose of them was to assist in managing any community outbreak that might happen, but originally in a context where there was a very low level of community transmission in the first place. In July 2020, there was a resurgence of the virus in Australia, and in August 2020 in New Zealand. So we've been able to examine how these apps have worked in the face of the resurgence that the apps were endeavouring to help with the management of. So the two apps themselves, the Australian app COVID Safe is a Bluetooth-based app. It's based on Singapore's BlueTrace open source software. The data is stored on Amazon Web Services in Australia. Users opt in by downloading from the Apple or Google app stores. It's cryptographically encoded. There's a handshake that occurs when any two app-enabled phones come within 2 meters of each other and remain within that proximity for at least 15 minutes. The system is opt-in both Australia and New Zealand because both countries have a very strong principle of privacy, so that there's been no compulsion on the users, been forcing users to use the apps. But, and because of that, there's a requirement also that the data is all stored on the phones. And in Australia's case, all of the handshake data is deleted after 21 days because it's believed at that point that it will not be needed any further. When a smartphone owner in Australia tests COVID positive, the user will then decide whether they will upload their phone data to the contact tracing service. The contact tracing service can then combine that information with other information that they hold with other people who are registered and other basic information that's held in the public health entity to identify who has been likely to have been infected out of the contacts that are identified, and then they will engage in a classic contact tracing process where they will identify people who need to have further action, list them, contact them, prepare them to engage in their next course of management of their particular state, and then follow up. The Australian option does have a potential to automatically contact people without having to go to the contact tracing system. And that is also the ability to send automated messages out to people who have been identified. The automatic broadcasts have not yet, I believe, been used in Australia, but in terms of the app itself generating the contacts to people who may have been in contact with the infected person. But certainly they have used automated messages from the system once contact tracers have evaluated and made an assessment whether the contact is a close contact who is likely to have been infected and therefore needs to go and be tested and possibly isolate or go into quarantine. So the Australian app, it's been very, in terms of Australian apps downloaded in a voluntary context, this one's been one of the most popular in terms of the number of people who've downloaded it, but it's still only been downloaded by about 25% of the population. The app is good at picking up people who come within the proximity of 2 meters apart for 15 minutes, which is the classic definition of what's required for the virus to be able to be transmitted from one person to another. But it does have some problem with some false positives because it's possible that you can identify phones across walls or barriers where in fact there's been no physical contact. So there is a risk that it might be picking up too many, and particularly if the automated notification happens it could result in too many people being notified, leading to too many people going to be tested. It also has problems with the false negatives because it can't actually detect the transmission of viruses of the virus by our surfaces. It's predicated on all of the transmission happening in a person-to-person airborne environment. So it's not necessarily picking up the ability to track all possible means of people transmitting the virus. But on the whole, in our assessment, it looks as though it's quite promising, but of course it's severely constrained by the number of people who have actually downloaded the app. It requires both the infected person and the contact who have downloaded the app for the information to be able to be exchanged. So if an infected person doesn't have the app, or they meet with people who don't have the app, then the information about who has been contacted is not available. The issue is here that the app should be able to pick up contacts between people who are not known to each other, because if those people are known to each other, then the contact tracers can elicit that information and identify who needs to be contacted and follow that through in their manual processes. The benefit of the Australian system is that it can identify people who are not known to each other, so they can then get that extra information to perhaps be able to intervene earlier than would have been the case otherwise. New Zealand COVID Tracer works on a very different basis. It works on QR codes, and it's predicated on the QR codes generating a digital diary that's kept on the cell phone of the people who download it. It's based on extending a concept of a contact register that was required by the New Zealand Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment in New Zealand to keep a register of all people who passed into premises while the country was in lockdown. That required contact information to be kept, and then that was used then by contact tracers to contact people who had been in the same location as someone who subsequently tested positive. The businesses are required, and now it's a requirement in New Zealand that all businesses and all public transport providers download QR codes, which must be displayed in every business premises, and that's been mandatory from August. Initially, it was voluntary, but it's now become mandatory, as I said, for businesses. The businesses are also required by law now to keep this mandatory record while the country is in the higher levels of lockdown, but not in lower levels of lockdown. Users download the app, they register their contact information, and they're then required every time they enter a premise, if they choose to scan the code, which then records the information on the phone, and it is deleted after 31 days. In the event that someone with a smartphone tests positive, then that person can voluntarily upload the diary data to the contact tracing service. That can then be combined with phone data, interview data, and then the contact tracer can contact the businesses and retrieve from them their registers of who in fact has been in the premise at the same time as the person who's tested positive. They can then use that combination of information to identify who needs to be a listed person and then contacted and followed up with the requirement to be tested or isolate. One of the problems with the New Zealand data is that in fact it requires a whole bunch of other information aside from what's collected on the phone for the whole system to function. There is an option for an automated alert. People who download the app can opt to be alerted if they have been in the same premise as a positive tested person when that person identifies, without it having to go through the contact tracing system. From our perspective, we believe that the New Zealand system is quite problematic. It identifies locations visited and not individuals. It has separate processes for the business as well as the individual, and that leads to the potential that there's a large amount of information collected at the business level that may not be collected in a consistent format, and there's a possible risk that it could end up with overloading of information in the system because the non-standard collection of the data at the business combined with the contact tracing information, has the potential to actually slow down the contact tracing process relative to no app, because there's just so much data to go through. And that leads to a possibility that we'll end up with just information overload in the event that the virus scales up, which could be dangerous because that could take longer, in fact, to identify and contact people who are likely to have contracted the virus, and that will slow down the rate at which they can be identified and put into isolation, because there'll be so much other information clogging the system. The system, of course, as New Zealand, is based on recording premise, location, rather than individuals. It's not able to identify, because the business information is only required to record people going into the business and not people leaving it. There's no possible way of being able to identify if an individual has been in the premise for 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or any other time at the same time as the positive person. So again, it runs the risk of generating a large number of false positives, which again can be problematic, because if these false positives then get contacted, they run the risk then of all going to be tested, clogging up the testing queues and further slowing down the ability for testing to identify the people who have actually transmitted the virus. So it requires an explicit amount of human judgment to work, so is therefore not well suited to automation. And the third problem is that when in fact the automatic notification is generated, this makes the problem even worse, because it massively increases the number of potential false positives that can be identified, because it will be everyone who's been in the building, not just those who've been in the able to be transmitted with the virus over that 15 minutes for within 2 meters for 15 minutes criterion. So we actually think that this particular application is not going to be very effective or scalable up when there's a large infection explosion, simply because of the huge number of false positives jamming the testing queues, plus the information overload for the manual contact tracers. The other problems there's a number of other problems with the New Zealand system as well, because it's location-based and business-based. It doesn't pick up exchanges that happen in places other than businesses, which of course infected people can go to many other places. There's potential large additional costs to the system, because there's a business cost. There's the risk of scanning fatigue amongst users. The one benefit, though, we could see of it is that it ensures that there is actually a record of up-to-date contact information when people register for the app in the first place. So the proof of the pudding in the New Zealand app, we believe, will be in the eating when there is actually a significant community outbreak. The current outbreak in August, September was relatively small, so the system wasn't tested. Apparently, anecdotally, only one particular user with the app was actually used in the contact tracing in relation to that outbreak. It's mandatory for businesses but not users. The standardization there's no standardization of the data, so that's a problematic issue going forward. We believe it could be improved, but we're still not convinced that it will be scalable. And it's not popular. Despite the fact that there's a huge number of downloads, what we've seen here is the app with the scanning in particular is just not happening. What we see here with the graph is the line here is the number of scans in total by day across the entire period that the app has been available. There was a big burst at the beginning of people downloading it. And then again, when the outbreak in August happened, there was a big burst of downloading again. The scans increased rapidly around that burst, but they peaked on the day here, which was the day that it became mandatory for the codes to be present on public transport. But beyond that, scanning has fallen away dramatically. In fact, it looks remarkably like the COVID curve itself. And the number of scans per app per day peaked at that same day again at, now this is 1.2 scans per app per day, which is practically nothing. And
Bronwyn, we need to come to an end. we need to come to an end, please.
At the moment, it's only running at about 0.4 scans per day. And when we even look at the number of scans per QR code issued, again, that's falling off rapidly. So it's not being used. It's not likely to be helpful. It's had no effect really on what's happened in New Zealand. So we don't think that that's going to be very effective going forward.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. That was a very interesting and comprehensive overview of what's going on in Australia and New Zealand, so to say down under from the European perspective. And I was in particular, I found it interesting, the resurgence, what happened during August or so in this country, and probably we can learn something in Europe from here. I'm now moving to Rosa Barcelo. And Rosa will give us a EU perspective of tracking and tracing apps from a data protection view. Rosa, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Georg. My idea was indeed to provide an overview of track and tracing apps in Europe. And I am a lawyer, I am in Brussels, I am specialized on data protection and privacy, so I will not touch on all the issues and cannot be as comprehensive as the previous speakers. I will focus more on the privacy and data protection aspects. So first thing I wanted to highlight is like 4 or 5 points that from a privacy perspective are the key ones in Europe. So first one is that this is an area where we have seen a very strong push by the European Commission and by the European institutions to make sure that what we have in the 27 countries that are members of the EU is an harmonized system. And even though the final competence to bring forward the apps is at national level, we have seen an enormous wealth of guidance by the Commission and by European Data Protection Board to make sure that the deployment is harmonized. So I don't want to repeat all the documents that we have, but just to mention 1 or 2, there is guidelines and a toolbox from the European Commission with the European Data Protection Board and member states, which what they do is they take the key regulations in Europe, the GDPR and the e-privacy directive, and they will establish how track and tracing apps comply with the regulation. So they will look at each one of the requirements and how track and tracing apps should comply. I think this is a particularly helpful one. A second one is a document by the European Data Protection Board that focuses on location data and how whether these apps use location data, what is the framework. And the final one is a document by the Commission on interoperability. And here again, making sure that the apps at EU level are harmonized. Now, this is the EU sort of perspective. And then what are the main points that define this guidance and that has been taken by member states? So first one, in my view, is centralized or decentralized, what approaches that had been explained. But we have seen how at the EU level, in the beginning, we departed from a certain ambiguity as to whether there was one better than the other. But as the months went by, pretty quickly, the EU embraced more a decentralized model. So the model of the Google, Apple decentralized model. This is why you see that the vast majority of member states have deployed decentralized models. And I realize there will be some people speaking about some countries. So it's just to give you an overview. We have Germany, Italy, Ireland, Spain. All of those are using decentralized models. And the one UK recently embraced the decentralized model. So, and those who are on centralized model are, for example, France is still using it. UK were going to use it, but it moved from one to the other. So bottom line, I think that we are more on a decentralized world. Second point is the voluntary approach. The European Union immediately put forward that apps should be based only on consent. so people download if they wish so. And this is what we have seen the model to basically to be the one used in Europe. Now, the voluntarity is extremely granular. It's not only voluntary to download the app, it goes to the recommendation is that it must be voluntary to upload the identifiers once you have been identified as a sick person. And so that you might have downloaded the app, but yet determine that you don't want to upload the identifiers. So is extremely based on will of the people. Third point, no location data should be collected. As the previous Australian model is the European model embraces Bluetooth and only proximity data to be used, but not location data. It's not important where you were, it's only important if you were close to somebody. So a strong push for no location data. Third point, data should be used only for the purposes of contact and tracing. There should not be some sort of any keeping of the data for other purposes, but a string limitation. Another point of data retention. Here again, I draw a comparison with Australia because the handshake data is also recommended to be kept by a month, 21 days, something like that. So again, a push for limited period of time. And I think I will leave it here for now. I think that this is the sort of the model that have emerged, and I think gives a hint of how the things are developing in Europe, with some countries more advanced than others, but we still have quite a few countries coming now in this last month in the deployment, even though in the beginning we heard the idea that everything should be ready before summer so that the summer holiday will enjoy it, but this has not been the case. We are seeing many apps still now being deployed. So Georg, I'll stop here and leave it to the next speakers.
Thank you, Rosa. That was super interesting, and thank you in particular for also keeping the time limit. What comes to my mind is we had a very interesting debate on first interoperability of apps, centralized versus decentralized. I think only 2 countries in Europe have centralized systems, and that discussion will be ongoing. And I think there is a lot of food for further discussion here. Let's now move to Stephen Schmidt. And Stephen will give us an update on the situation in Canada, give us probably a couple of examples, and what have been the greatest legal and organizational changes from a Canadian perspective. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georg. I think it's useful to scene set on our COVID situation in Canada and then get to our app situation. So our mortality outcome sitting right now at about 240 deaths per million of population are broadly in line with the EU average of 215 deaths per million of population. It's important to say that, I'm going to dig below the numbers a little bit, but our success or non-success in confronting COVID in Canada has not been app-led. It has not featured hyperscaled testing. It has rather featured much more traditional measures around, vigorous social and economic lockdown, high levels of social discipline, high levels of trust in government, but not a lot of technology. If you dig down below our numbers, it's interesting. 2/3 of the fatalities in Canada are concentrated in a single province, namely Quebec. When you pull out Quebec out of the equation for a moment, our public health outcomes are in line with Germany. And then when you dig a little deeper even, we have 1 province and 3 territories with no deaths at all. So in those places, they're in line with absolutely the global best, the Taiwans, the Vietnams, et cetera. So Canada's a big country, 2nd largest country on earth. There's a range of outcomes from really terrible to absolutely world-class. None of it has depended on apps at this time. None of it has depended on hyperscale testing. So what's our app story? To put it in ROSA terms, we are following the European dominant model of decentralized and voluntary using the Apple, Google exposure notification technology. So no geolocation data is collected, no personal information is collected or shared. The privacy issues at some fundamental level have been designed away, you could say. We introduced our app 4 months after the early adopters, so 4 months after Singapore, Iceland, and Czech Republic. We are a federation, and health is a shared constitutional responsibility, so that limits the ability of the federal government to impose it coast to coast. So the rollout was negotiated. At this point, perhaps unfortunately, only 2 provinces have agreed to adopt it. Ontario, the most populous province, and more recently Newfoundland, a small eastern province. Adoption rates are low, sitting at about 15%. So not a lot going on the app front. So if you want to think about it in terms of challenges to rollout or adoption, I think it looked a lot like the debate in Europe, where privacy concerns, whether real or imagined, and I say imagined in the sense of public perception of issues that might not be there if you actually understand how the apps work. So we've gotten to the point in Canada where probably the biggest obstruction to adoption is not actual privacy issues, but public perceptions or misperceptions of the issue. So there's not a lot of public acceptance. There's a lot of concern that the government is collecting health data or location data, and there's also public perception that in any event the apps don't work. Looked at it this way, we may have a kind of a knowledge problem in the sense that our public health knowledge and our international knowledge is simply immature about not sufficiently developed about the effectiveness of these apps. And secondly, I think we have a public health communications challenge. If these apps, properly understood, can relieve the severity of lockdowns, can relieve the severity of economic closures, and give you a better outcome with a more proportional, lighter touch solution, it's fantastic. If it can substitute or alleviate the harshness of wide-scale lockdowns. So, TBD, I think we have to deepen our understanding globally, and we have to deepen our capacity at sort of public health communication of the benefits of this, if the benefits are borne out over time. But right now, Canada continues on a path that is much more of a traditional public health response and not a high-tech response a la Taiwan or South Korea. Thank you, Georg.
Thank you, Stephen. It's amazing to see how this huge country manages from, as you said, from the worst to the world class. Super interesting. Thank you. I'm now moving on to Christian Winkelhofer, who will give us a quick update on the situation in Austria. What have been the greatest challenges for the developing the app in Austria?
Sure. Hi, this is Christian speaking. I'm the project manager of the Stop Corona app. That is the contact tracing app based on those principles that Rosa has already laid out to do contact tracing in a decentral way. So first of all, the starting point of creating such an app was the pandemic situation back in March. And if you take a look at the situation in Austria, so Austria is located in the heart of Europe with 8 million people, there was this big restrictions down in March, the hammer, the lockdown, the massive restrictions to avoid the collapse of the system, of the health system. And at this point in time, the Austrian Red Cross, as the crisis management organization of the government, contacted us to create support by technology means to help to improve the situation. And currently we are now in this dance phase, as so many other countries as well, where basically the containment 2.0 strategy is having highly sensitive sensitivity to see potential cases by exacting also a high false positive rate and do quick testing at the same time so that you get the knowledge if this is a correct positive, or if not, then you can also act accordingly. But the quick testing is the important thing to manage an open society without deep restrictions. The story of creating the app, the starting point, as I said, was back in March, when there was this high uncertainty how the whole situation will evolve. But also in this very uncertain situation, the crisis management team of the Red Cross always fostered their guidelines. First of all, having an technical solution that is fast and impactful, so that it's working. The second one is a secure and robust solution. And the third one is a solution that will scale quickly. And with the question in mind, how can technology support the current situation in 2 to 4 weeks from now, when the pandemic hit its peak, we developed this contact tracing app based on a simple idea. The idea is we asked the users, we did a lot of user research and asked them, how would you accept an app on your mobile phone that is supporting contact tracing? And the users, so why we did the user research is rather simple. You cannot force any particular person to use a mobile app on your mobile phone. You can switch off Bluetooth, you can have a second mobile phone. There are so many ways you can get around with it. So the major success criteria is acceptance by the people. And we asked the people, what is the condition that you will use such an app? And the first thing they said is, no one wants to be traced. So also this mobile app should act in a privacy-preserving way. And the most privacy-preserving architecture you can build is this decentral architecture. Back at that time in March, there was no Google and Apple framework, exposure notification framework out there. Even the Singapore solution, which could be considered a central solution, was not open sourced at that time. And so we started to develop within 3 weeks from starting the concept phase till the rollout to create a contact tracing app that is working in an anonymous way. People also said in such a pandemic situation to trust the crisis management team of the Austrian Red Cross, for example, even more than the government. And that's why in Austria, the Red Cross is the issuing organization for such an app. And also a very important thing is to talk to the civil society. In this case, it was NGOs. So all the major data protection NGOs did take their share. And from a closed source starting point to be fast and effective, we opened it to a trust and source approach that we shared it with universities, the source code, and shared it with NGOs, till the point where we open sourced the solution so that trust is created by openness of the source code. And so I want to wrap up, as we have been the first contact tracing app in Europe with the shortest go-to-market approach, with the first decentral contact tracing approach in the world, we also stayed in close contact with Google and Apple, and we had many calls to share our experience to make their framework as relevant as it could be at that time. So back to you, Georg.
Thank you, Christian. That was super interesting. It shows hands-on experience, how you did that, and what have been the practical details. Very interesting indeed. I'm now moving on to Amélie. Amélie will give us an overview of what has been done in South Korea, Taiwan, and Iceland, and how effective this was to flatten the curve. Amélie.
Hi, everyone. So the question was, were app and big data analytic effective in the fight against the pandemic? So I will start my talk with defining big data. Big data is used to describe the massive volume of both structured and unstructured data that is so large it is difficult to process using traditional techniques. And when you think about big data, you have to consider the 6V. First, big data is big. With the dramatic growth of the internet, mobile devices, social media, the amount of data generated by all the sources has grown accordingly. In addition to getting bigger, the generation of data and organizations' ability to process it is accelerating. In the big data world, data often come in unstructured format like social media posts, server log data, latitude, longitude, geo-coordinate, but also photos, audio, videos, and free text. So there is a huge variety of data. The meaning of words of unstructured data can change based on context, so data are variable. The veracity deals with exploring a dataset for quality and systematically cleaning that data to be useful for analysis. And data have value. So it must be combined with rigorous processing and analysis to be useful. During the COVID-19 pandemic, countries that have maintained low COVID-19 per capita mortality rates appear to share strategies that include early surveillance, testing, contact tracing, and strict quarantine. The scale of coordination and data management required for effective implementation of the strategies has, in most successful countries, relied on adopting digital technology and integrating it into policy and healthcare. Also, it's important to note that regarding Asian countries, several did experience SARS outbreak in 2002 and 2003, like Hong Kong and Singapore, or Middle East respiratory syndrome outbreak in 2015, like in South Korea, and they were therefore better prepared. So we have new tools for a new problem, COVID-19, and I will describe now 3 examples of apps and big data that were successful in mitigating the burden of COVID-19 or understanding some epidemiological patterns of the outbreak. And I will start with the example of the tracking of COVID-19 cases in Taiwan. As soon as China reported the outbreak, the Taiwanese government embraced big data. Taiwan integrated its centralized real-time national health surveillance database with its immigration and customs database to begin the creation of big data for analytics. That allowed them case identification by generating real-time alerts during a clinical visit based on travel history and clinical symptoms. And therefore, it has helped healthcare facilities to identify individuals for COVID-19 and who should be tested and tracked or not. Moreover, the Central Epidemic Command Center has partnered with policy agencies and telecom companies to enforce quarantine with the support of mobile phone tracking. Taiwan's proximity to Wuhan made the region particularly susceptible to COVID-19, but its efficient use of big data is credited for the low number of cases and deaths. My second example deals with the contact tracing in South Korea. South Korea has integrated digital technology into government coordinated containment and mitigation processes, including surveillance, testing, contact tracing, and strict quarantine, which could be associated with the early flattening of its incidence curve. By checking the video footage of the location of patient paths, closed-circuit television, also called video surveillance, provided help to identify the detail of each situation. For example, video surveillance was used to evaluate the level of exposure risk by identifying whether the patient wore a mask or had respiratory symptoms such as a cough. Identification of contact and at-risk persons has been highly effective by using this technology. And my last example is an example of the screening for COVID-19 infections in Iceland. Using mobile technology, Iceland collects data on patient-reported symptoms and combines this data with other data sets, such as clinical and genomic sequencing data, to reveal information about the pathology and spread of the virus. This approach has added to the worldwide scientific knowledge regarding the prevalence and transmission of asymptomatic COVID-19 persons. To date, Iceland has had the highest per capita testing rate and among the lowest per capita COVID-19 mortality rates. In conclusion, apps, digitally enhanced tracing and big data techniques likely has a role to play in flattening the infection curve and helping us understand the epidemiology of COVID-19 and mitigate its impact. Some Asian countries offer successful strategies, at least so far, in battling the pandemic, but they use tactics that the US and Europe may not be able to replicate.
Thank you, Amelie. That was a very interesting view on from a different part of the globe. And it's great to have you here and that you share your experience with us. We have now the last speaker in this row, again on something about big data and the role of big data, Christian Fritsch. He will speak about the strategic value of mobile floating phone data for the telecom industry, big data analysis, and mobile floating phone data. Christian, the floor is yours.
May I interrupt, Jörg? Happily, Mr. Sugabe has joined as well, so he can speak later.
That is great. So I will ask him then, turn the floor to him after Christian.
Okay, then welcome and good day also from my side. I'm Christian Fritsch. I was one of the guys launching a business that is dealing with location data. And the subject I would like to discuss today is also from my past experience of the last 10 years or even longer than that, what strategic value location data can bring to the table once you discuss the interaction of people between each other in a territory. Firstly, I would like to mention also the concept of big data in the world of this data-driven analytics. So you always have two parameters where you have to look at like every business idea, every concept that you're dealing with. The one is the coverage that you're able to gain once you have a solution in place. So coverage is one point. And the second is the accuracy. So when we are discussing together with all the stakeholders in the field in Austria and also some other countries, we always discuss the quantity of what is the coverage that we could look at. And using mobile floating phone data and especially location data here, you can really reach up to 100% of the population because almost everybody has a mobile phone now with him. So why location data really matters? Because it provides information regarding the time and space of like the movements of the people. And every time it's always the same and it repeats every day. And there's a constant flow in everyday's life. You have a stimulus that's more or less the trigger why you actually want to move. You see then that there's a people's movement throughout the country. And movement needs space. And this happens also within the time period. And once you have the space, then you need the concept, which is like the streets and all the pathways connecting different places together. Also public transportation and stuff like that. So that needs also the plan how to really build it. And once you have the plan, then you need some data where you can test different models, different strategies of how you actually provide access to the infrastructures. And once you're discussing that point, you need data from, for example, mobile operators, from smartphones, from devices that are connected, because there you can gain lots of insights. There are also aspects related to the analog and the digital world, because during the old days, we were counting on the street sideways with or manual counting devices, right? And everybody, like a student's job, it was really nice to spend the whole day counting the traffic on the streets and filling out such form templates. But in reality, we don't need to do that even longer because we have nowadays the sensors with us, and those are the mobile phones. And even if we don't trust the mobile phones, we can put also a framework in place that is completely anonymizing the information that is like transmitted to a central site where you have the data analytics part that is using then the data that is generated from a mobile phone. So my saying is location data matters, and it could be of an importance to really use it in a way that is practically and also sufficient to reach the point of data privacy in the field. And we have implemented such a thing with Invenium and A1 Austria, the mobile network operator, and that was also shown in different media throughout the crisis and the time periods. And I have also brought some other examples because I think it's really useful to see how this evolves even more into the field of other countries and other data practices. So considering Telefonica Germany and Teralytics, they have something similar in place nowadays. You can look at the link, it is given there, Deutschland bleibt zu Hause, teralytics.net. So this is an example that's more or less the same implementation as we did it in Austria and some other countries. And you will see there that this is the interactive dashboard of the mobility pattern of the whole country, given a representative share of only one mobile network operator. So when you look at, again, at the two factors like coverage and accuracy, then we'll see that the coverage is really great because that's like millions of SIM cards that are connected to the mobile network operator of Telefonica Germany. However, we have always the two factors. So coverage is good, but accuracy is maybe a problem. And that is also the point why such applications or such dashboards, interactive dashboards, are not really used by the users themselves because accuracy is the point where it really misses some of the credentials that we've just discussed before, because you can't really get to the level of the proximity of like the near neighborhood. It's always depending on the size of the network given the mobile operator's infrastructure. And saying that, we have, I think, to combine both worlds and to use them in an integrated way. To be on the one hand side able to get the macroscopic view on how the mobility pattern looks like for the whole country. And here, for example, you see where did the movement change between two different weeks happen in a territory. And once it is like a higher movement indicated, then it turns red. And if it's lower, then it turns green. It's again a separation of Germany as it was not the case for the last 30 years. On the right-hand side, you see another example. I was also in contact with guys from US. It's a company called XMode. And what they're doing is they're like sitting as a toolkit on an app, and they're getting all the location data via those apps, and they're using it. And if you are also interested in using those data for like research or some like non-business concept, then you could also go to the AWS Amazon Web Services homepage, and there you could also access those data. They provide it for free, and you can look at how actually these like apps generated location data would be used from that point of view. So that's a quick overview regarding what we did in terms of using location data, again in a completely anonymized way. And I think that helped, at least from a governmental perspective, to generate a macroscopic view on how the mobility pattern looks like for the whole country.
Thank you, Christian. That was super interesting to see how big data, how apps can work together to help to fight the pandemic. We have now the great honor that Professor Sogabe appeared somehow like a miracle. And I would like to give him the word. I'm very sorry that it's so late for you, actually. So can you, and we know that you will sneak out after your presentation. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you share? Okay. So
You see your screen?
It's shared now.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, first of all, I'm very sorry I'm late due to a mistake of time difference. So I will briefly introduce the situation in Japan. First, the general context. So next page, please. So general context. The infection in Japan is not as serious as in Europe and the United States. The population of Japan is about 120 million. The number of infected people is about 1,800, and the number of deaths is about 1,500. Therefore, as shown on the slide, behavior regulations to prevent infection is also loose. So-called lockdown was not carried out, and it was left to the voluntary cooperation of citizens. Now, next slide, please. Now I'm going to the contact tracing app. This application called Coco was launched in Japan on June 19, and the number of downloads to date is about 17.5 million, or about 14% of the population. As with most countries, contact tracing app in Japan use Google and Apple's API. Therefore, the government obtains very little personal data. Moreover, the use of the app is voluntary. Therefore, no specific privacy law issues have been raised. The contact tracing app is implemented as a central government policy. In contrast, some local governments have introduced other mechanisms. This is a system whereby QR codes are posted at facilities where people gather, such as shopping centers, stadiums, public facilities, or restaurants. And users are made to read these QR codes. It is a bit similar to Singapore's safe entry system, but the registration is voluntary and only requires an email address, so privacy concerns are small. Correspondingly, the effectiveness is limited. From the above, we can see that in Japan, there is a central government contact tracing application that focuses on people and a local government system that focuses on location. In the following, I'd like to point out 4 current issues with central government contact tracing app. The first is that it may not be effective enough. As mentioned earlier, it should be noted that the number of downloads is 14% of the population. No, previous slides, please. Okay, that's there is another point to be made here. That is, it is estimated that when a PCR tests positive, the individual must enter the positive information into the app, but in reality, many of them do not enter this information into the app, even if they test positive. As a result, only about 900 positive registrations have been made. The number of positive registrations should be much higher, as there were over 1,600 people tested positive during this time. The clear reason for the low number of positive registration is unclear, but countermeasures such as asking laboratories to encourage people to register are being considered. Second, the government, next slide, please. Okay. Second, the government doesn't have sufficient information about bugs. Sorry, next one, please. Bugs. In the app. To protect privacy, the information collected through the app was kept to a minimum. As a result, it was not possible to collect information about the bugs, and the information needed to fix these bugs was not available. To deal with this, it is currently under consideration to add a function to send operation logs when a bug occurs with the consent of the user. Third, the actions that the notified person should take when receiving a contact notification through the app. Currently, contact notifications are understood as an opportunity for the notified person to take a PCR test. However, due to limited testing capacity, even with a contact notification, it takes up to 5 days to get tested. Therefore, it has been argued that the main purpose of the contact notification is understood as an opportunity for self-isolation, and the user interface should be changed to achieve this. Fourth, and the last one, it is about expanding functionality of the app. The current app only has the ability to notify the user of contact with a person tested positive. It is argued that additional features should be added for more effective infection control. Specifically, the app could ask the recipient to enter health information such as body temperature, chills, taste disorder, etc., and then analyze it with an algorithm to recommend a medical consultation or use this health information for research. However, such an expansion of function would be a major policy change and may not be easy to implement. Here is a brief introduction to the situation and issues in Japan. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Sogabe. That was extremely helpful. And I'm sorry that you had to wait so long because of the technical glitches. If you want to leave now, everybody would understand because of the very late time on your place. Dear speakers and ladies and gentlemen, we have now closed the round number 1, and I'm going to open round number 2. And because of the already progressed time, I kindly ask all speakers to keep a 3-minute limit, strict 3-minute limits, because we have only 27 minutes left until the Q&A starts. I would like to start now with Bronwyn. Can you give us a little bit of an outlook? What do you think, based on the learnings you have collected in Australia and New Zealand, what can be done better in the future?
Well, I think in the New Zealand and Australian context, I think what we've learned here is that contact tracing is inherently a human process, that in fact the way it operates is with the contact tracers themselves engaging with the people who've been identified as likely contacts and linking through to the testing system. Because if the R0 is going to be reduced, it's the speed of time, as the previous speaker said, which the people who have been infected can be identified and isolated as quickly as possible. That usually can't be left up to the individuals themselves because they're not aware of the issues of the urgency of doing it. So if we look at what contact tracing is, it's about identifying the close contacts, listing them and following up on them as soon as possible. So we need to have systems that integrate well with the existing human systems so that the apps complement the activities that the human contact tracers do. Because most of the literature shows that the apps on their own are not a silver bullet. They're not going to solve things. It's how well they integrate with the rest of the health applications, and in particular the issues of linking through to the testing system and the isolation systems and following through that's going to matter. What we've seen in the Australian app is that the Australian app helps with identifying and notifying the contacts, and it's helpful in that respect, but it still doesn't actually get to the people who've been infected if there's only low uptake. So that app might help and reduce the load on contact tracers if enough people use it. In the New Zealand case, that focuses on just the supplementary data that's available. In that sense, it's not actually helping the human processes, it's possibly getting in the way of them. So I think the issue of thinking about these apps is not just about what they do with the technology, but how that technology integrates in with the health systems of identifying and isolating the people who have got the disease as quickly as possible. And that's why it matters if the apps are actually notifying the wrong people and clogging up the testing system. That's going to slow down the ability to get people isolated, and the R naught will blow out. So we want to do things that will reduce their load and make them more efficient. And if the apps are thinking about how that works, then they'll complement those existing systems and make them more efficient, which ultimately I think should be the objective of them if they're working within an existing contact tracing system. So again, contact tracing is a human process. The phones act as proxies for humans. The QR codes tie to locations. In that sense, the Bluetooth apps seem to be more promising in the long run because of their focus on the key characteristics for actually identifying the transfer of the virus, which is most likely to happen when people have been within the proximity of 2 meters for 15 minutes or more, rather than the focus on locations, because the location data gets too many false positives. You want to actually get the people who are most likely to be infected, and that comes from the human contact. But once more, it's only as the systems are only going to be as good as how they supplement the rest of the back office of the health system and make that more efficient.
Thank you, Bronwyn. That was a very interesting overview on the way forward, and that definitely apps are not silver bullets. App help complement the human brain, so to say, in the human action. I move on now to Rosa. Rosa, for you as a lawyer, are you seeing companies or some of your clients deploying tracking and tracing apps for the workforce? And what are the main GDPR data protection issues to consider in this context? Rosa, you are on mute.
Okay, here we are. So thank you, Georg. Yeah, so here, like working as a lawyer, we have been having quite a few companies. Usually the profile is large companies, multinationals with big workforces that by the nature of their work, they cannot telework. They have to go to work. So these companies have an interest in deploying track and tracing apps, which are not going to be the national ones that we have been now looking at, but they will be just track and tracing apps for the company to use within the company. So the normal thing that we will have is a phone call and somebody says, we want to deploy them. Is it legal? Is it lawful? Can we do it? And that's usually lawyers, we are never very clear. So it's always maybe, depend what you do. So there are some sort of checks that one need to assess. And the first one that all companies will ask is, can we require it to each one of the employees? Because, I mean, we have seen in the national ones that in Europe, at least, they are voluntary. But what is the beauty of using an app within the company that also costs money, and people want to, that the company, if most of the employees are not going to use it? So there is a very strong urge to make them mandatory. And in deciding whether you can use them or not, there's some sort of consideration. In the 3 minutes, we don't have time, but there is one that is quite important: is the device the company device, or is the device the user device? This might make a difference on whether you can require the use of the app. So that's, I would think, is the number one, the one topic, voluntary or non-voluntary. Number two is works councils or work representative. You know, this might be quite of a hurdle. We need to inform them, that's for sure. Do we need their consent? So though the workers' council need to consent to the company deploying it. So that's number two. And this is quite, in Europe, there is quite of national variations on that. So it might not be the same in the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, etc. So number three and number four is, three is notifications. We know we have very strict requirement for transparency. So what I do is spend a lot of time to, if this is deployed, what we tell employees that what happens with the data. Number four is, where is the data sitting? Many of these apps are not European. They might be provided and the information managed outside Europe. And we know that we have in Europe the regulation, the GDPR, that limits the transfer of data. Recently, the United States system called Privacy Shield was deemed illegal. This means that data cannot travel to the US on the basis of the shield. This means that you have to find another basis on which the data will be traveled to wherever this is managed. So this is, you need to put in place contact with the vendors of the apps to make sure that this is done properly. And finally, do, as usual, a privacy impact assessment that might need to be shown to the data protection authorities in some cases. So this is a quick overview to show that, yes, it can be done, but there is all the checks to make sure that the regulations are complied. So I stop here, 3 or 4 minutes.
Thank you, Rosa. That was super interesting because I think there is this stretch between to find the right balance between what is mandatory, what is voluntary. And I've seen recently an article from a well-known lawyer in Austria. He said, when fighting against a pandemic, the term voluntary has no place if you want to fight a pandemic. It's an interesting position.
Georg, just to add just one point that I think that in this determination of whether these apps are permitted, very important point is the location. I forgot that, but making sure that the content, it only works in the premises or when you are working. When you go back home, there's a stop.
Yeah, that's a very important thing. Thank you for adding this. I'm now moving to Stephen Schmidt and his views on the trade-off between collective security, fighting the pandemic versus individual liberty, including data protection. So Stephen, in a nutshell, what is your view at this?
I'm going to breathlessly and quickly offer you a handful of tensions to consider or working hypotheses to consider that can speak to app adoption. So here I go in 3 minutes. The tension between an orientation towards collective rights versus individual rights may have some explanatory power. So the paradigmatic collectivist societies would be the Confucian East Asian societies, the Taiwans, the Singapores, et cetera. Very high app adoption propensity there. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the US as the paradigmatically individually oriented society, and we have a different story in terms of app use there. Form of government, does it have explanatory power? Probably less. You have democracies that have mandated the app, India and Israel. You have non-democracies as well that have mandated the app, China, for example. Looking at privacy, it's interesting. We may have gotten to the point where we collectively across Europe and North America have so over-indexed on the privacy thing that positive public health outcomes may be yielding to privacy considerations. We may have got the calculus wrong. Georg, you gave us that quote a moment ago, that consent may have no place. It's interesting if you applied all the privacy strictures that have been now attached to apps in Canada and in Europe. If you attach all those strictures to the traditional public health pandemic response, it would break down. It wouldn't function because, of course, traditional tracing, quarantine, lockdown, all these measures, of course, depend on the ability of the health system to share data. Very personal data about the ill person, who they are, where they live, when they got sick, et cetera. I mean, you could sort of say at some level, non-privacy is foundational to the functional of traditional public health system. So we may have got the balance wrong on the apps, but time will tell. It's interesting in the employment setting, a different balance is being set, and that may be interesting, TBD, if we learn more things. My last point I'm going to throw out as a tool for explanatory power, it may be that rate of smartphone adoption will also tell you something about adoption and success of apps, so that traditional leaders in terms of smartphone smartphone adoption are the Singapores, the Taiwans, the South Korea. You also see them strongly associated with app use during the pandemic. And then correspondingly on the other side, countries without smartphone capacity at all in the developing world, et cetera, you can just see counterfactually that apps probably won't function at all there or in a very limited way. That's 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for these very insightful views. And I think this debate will be ongoing. I'm now asking Christian Winkelhofer, against the background of your experience from the Austrian app development and introduction. So what are the most important takeaways?
Thanks, Georg. So one of the most important takeaways in contact tracing is time. And just bear a second with me to understand this chart here. So it's the viral load over time. And in this example, Bob was infected on day 1. And on day 4, his viral load was so high that he was going to be infectious and infected N. And then on day 6, Bob developed symptoms and felt that he was ill. And now you need to be super fast with contact tracing, because on day 7 onwards, N is going to be infectious as well. And if you want to break the infection chain, time is a critical factor. And just to show you how we did build in this functionality in the app. So basically, we implemented not only to inform someone with when you have the test result, but you can also start with a symptom check that you, if you feel symptoms, are then already able to inform your people that you have met in a soft way. We call it yellow warning, that they should stay away from healthy people because they might have been in touch with someone who is going, it could be infectious. And then when you get your test result, you can either do the de-warning and say, well, I have a negative test result, it was nothing, green, or you can do the warning and the red flag telling, yes, it was a confirmed infection, so please go into quarantine and stay at home for 10 days. So time is a critical factor. The other one is acceptance and usage. And I think we had already an interesting discussion seeing the situation in Japan and in Australia. And if you take a look at the chart number 3 here, is the download number of iOS and Android. So Austria has a population of 8 million people and it's now 1 million downloads. If you take away the elderly people who are not used to apps and young people who have no smartphone, it's roughly about between, let's say, 15% of the population having the app downloaded. But be careful, there is a deinstallation rate of nearly 50%. So the effective usage of the app is much lower. And then you see in the upper part the 2 different mechanisms how people could issue a warning, because before the Google and Apple framework was in place, we had our own system. And here you can see roughly about 160 messages that have been sent over the system in a period from April to June, and starting from July onwards, you can see nearly 1,000 people have used the system to issue a yellow or a red warning. And here you can also see, as it is intentionally, many people sent the yellow warning early, and after the test, only a small portion have been identified as red as a confirmed test. But that's the major issue. So how to drive adoption and acceptance, that's a thing you need to consider. If you issue a digital product, you need also to cater for the marketing and the advertisement of it. And that's crucial for the success.
Thank you, Christian. So it's time, acceptance, and usage. I think that will keep us busy for quite a while, I guess. I'm now asking Amelie, and maybe you, Amelie, you can give us a couple of insights on what are the limitations of the measures put in place to fight the pandemic, and what can be done better in future.
Yeah, so okay. So actually, as it has been already said in the chat, mobile apps cannot be said to do contact tracing, but rather they do proximity tracking and exposure notification That is to say, they track and alert users who have been in close contact proximity with each other, which can support contact tracing. The good thing with them is that they do not rely on the memory of the people, and they can also notify cases on people unknown from the case, because you meet people at the gym that you don't know, and the mobile app can notify them. A contact person is a person potentially exposed to the virus through being in proximity to an infected person for a sufficient time and at close enough distance. So currently, the European Centre for Disease Control defines high-risk exposure and low-risk exposure contact, depending on the type and distance of exposure to the case, as shown in the table I'm showing to you that I will not detail now. However, these definitions cannot be directly translated to proximity tracing by mobile apps. For example, apps will not know if a contact occurred face-to-face or in a closed environment, or whether there were a barrier between people, such as a screen used in banks or face masks, for example. So public health authorities have to ensure that time and distance settings are broad enough to capture contact most at risk. However, if settings are such that a large number of people are determined to be a contact and asked to take measures such as self-quarantine, this could induce a burden on individuals and society, and over time likely reduce the acceptability and uptake of the app. Calibration and evaluation is critical as apps start to be used in order to ensure that the settings are optimal and adapted to the specific epidemiological situation. And public health authorities are recommended to work with app developers to ensure that it is possible to obtain and analyze data to evaluate proximity setting. So current ECDC contact tracing guidelines recommend that high exposure contacts are asked to self-quarantine, whereas low exposure contacts are asked to respect physical distancing and avoid traveling. So determining the level of exposure is really important. We also may work on the sense that it would be possible to integrate a notion of cumulative exposure in the apps. For example, if the current definition of a high-risk exposure contact is 15 minutes or more at a distance of 2 meters or less, the apps should be able to detect a cumulative exposure of 15 minutes over a period of time. In other words, the two people should not have to be within 2 meters for 15 minutes continuously for the app to recognize this exposure. So this is one limitation that I see as an epidemiologist with using this contact tracing app.
Thank you, Amélie. I think there is a lot to take from this experience and from these thoughts, and how we can do better in future and how to fight the pandemic. I think this will all keep us busy for quite a while. Not only politicians, also business persons and scientists and everybody. I'm now finally moving to Christian Fritsch, and Christian will give us his views on privacy issues in the context of mobile floating phone data, interactive dashboards for the visualization of mobile data insights, and a kind of outlook.
Yes. So moving on to the slide that I've brought with me, it's all about the data privacy aspects of mobility analysis. And when you touch the mobility analysis, I think the framework that is distributed by different bodies of the European Commission really highlights the point that you have to enable the privacy by design principles, which is once you build the app, once you build the platform, once you build the visualization, you have to consider also that the data needs to be protected. Once you do that, you have different viewpoints on which you can focus, directly assessing also the value of the insight versus the data privacy potential that it actually brings with it. Because on the end of the day, the less value will be given, the higher the data protection is. Therefore, I think that we have to think about trading data privacy for a benefit that the user gains once he gives the data. And this is also based on voluntary access to some portals where you, for example, would have the same as we had now in the tennis game of the US Open, where we saw basically a bubble which was created for the players, but they had to remain within the bubble, not using any contacts or interactions with anybody outside. But once they stayed there in this bubble, everything was good, and it was also kind of a safe place, a safe haven, so to say, where nobody could then interfere, and therefore it was possible to also come to process with this tournament. So on the left-hand side, you have a table mentioning some of the issues of working with a data privacy officer and to realize the potential of providing the right and correct form of data privacy and the protection of the whole system. On the right-hand side, what we have also experienced from our work over the last couple of years is you need to reach some compliancy with the data principles that are given by law. And therefore, you need to have a transparent IT infrastructure. You need to work through the processes to secure also the IT infrastructure. So where does the data really sit, and what data centers you're using? So one thing that we've always encountered was also an exchange and a dialogue with national data protection officers, and also some standardizing bodies like TÜV and external auditors, making also our work a little bit easier, because they were testing and they were auditing those work that we've been implementing. With the universities, I think it's also worthwhile to discuss because they're really experts and they're also sitting in the policy making front. That means that they're discussing on the one hand side the creation of a new law, of a new guideline, and on the other side they're also there helping you to find the right aspect how to deal with such regulations. Yeah, so that was my view on data privacy and also what you could do once discussing and implementing such an application.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. That was our last contribution. And let me take this opportunity now, because this closes round number 2. First of all, I would like to thank all speakers for the rich and in-depth insights and for your cooperation to stay within the challenging time schedule as kind of straitjacket for everybody. What I also thought a couple of times when I did the preparatory work for this webinar and also during this discussion, I think this event can contribute to a kind of community building for further interactions, exchanges between the panelists on the one hand, and also between the panelists and our guests, which will now then be invited by Eric for further inputs or for questions and Q&A. With this and my thanks to everybody, giving back the floor to Eric.
Okay, thank you very much. And for all the speakers and for sharing all this. Now, we got quite a few interesting questions. What I can do is that some of you asked, I can, if you want those who made a question, I can make you so you can talk. So for instance, the first one raising a question was Scott Marcus. See if you're here and still on. It seems like Scott has left the floor. No, you were there. That's right. So I push allow to talk. So you can mention your question, Scott. You have 2 questions.
Yes, well, actually, it's really one question with an extension. So my question is really about the, can everyone hear me?
Sure.
Good, great. My question really relates to the difference between the European approaches and those taken in many other parts of the world, especially in Asia. I would argue that what we have in Europe is really an exposure notification system, not a true contact tracing system. It informs people that they're at risk of having been infected, but it's not at all integrated with the rest of the healthcare system. It doesn't contain any location information. And so the natural question would be, to what extent can it be expected to really be effective? Now, Dr. Devar Larive really spoke to that a little bit in her remarks. I would welcome some thoughts about that from the other panelists. It's closely related to the question that Georg posed in the first place about individual versus collective approaches. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Maybe if I make this voluntary response, so Christian raises his hand, so please go ahead.
Sure. So that's an excellent remark you're making. So what is the cultural background of a society and which kind of measures are they going to accept is one part of the answer. The other one is technology can help, but technology is not the only way how to treat such a situation. And for example, in Austria, there is this kind of contact tracing done by an app, which, as I said, is done anonymously, and by the fact that it is done in an anonymous way, it cannot be integrated in the health system at all. But at the same time, there is this physical, let's say, contact tracing where people talk to each other, take the notes, write the lists, and then inform the people. And this information based on information from face to face is issuing another legal quality. So then you get your written approval that you need to stay at home, for example, versus the app is informing you, you had contact with somebody, but you do not know exactly what the legal consequences are.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody want to add anything to, again, Christian Fritsch? Sorry,
right.
Yes, please go ahead.
Right. So yeah, I think that's definitely the point that we see that on the one hand side we have those tracing apps. We have also the contact centers that are contacting the positives and discussing with them all the different questions that were also like indicated and requested to ask from WHO. And I think that the next step could be that you have the tracing nowadays, but it will become a tracking in the next phase once we are really standing in front of the second wave, because then it's really getting again to a limitation of the whole ecosystem of the country. And avoiding that, I think, is one chance to go from a tracing to a tracking, where, for example, before you even have the request of moving somewhere, or before you want to have an interaction with someone, or before you go shopping, you kind of request your particular slot for the location and also for the interactions that you're going to have. And then you get a ticket that you're allowed to have then, for example, those interactions and visiting those guys. And then it's much clearer also for everybody what was like the scenario with those interactions and how did they take place actually. But it will take time for sure.
Okay, I think Bronwyn raised also her hand.
Right.
Yes.
I think from the New Zealand and Australian perspective, I think what we can contribute to this is that we actually had some strong leadership right from the start from the public health authorities, and that the development of the apps within the New Zealand context has been led by the health authorities, not by the industry. And I think that's where, to the extent that the contact tracing processes have sat at the core of what's happened in New Zealand and Australia, rather than them being something developed externally and bolted on, I think has been quite important. And I gather that that's also been the case in the Asian countries. Unfortunately, without our Japanese colleague here to confirm that, I can't say, but following the lead of Singapore, where the models have been developed, it was very much that central leadership. And that's where the technology sector can't do it on its own, and it needs to have that partnership and integration and the joint development to be able to get it to go to the next step. And I assume that will be exactly the case as well with big data. In the New Zealand and Australian context as well, because we've already got a high level of trust within the health system about how the data is going to be managed, I think to the extent that there was a compliance within this part is because there's a trust in the health system to look after the data better than if it had been other parts of government or even the private sector holding it. So that again, I think has been part of, at least in the New Zealand case, why there's been a high level of downloading of the data. We've had about 45% of the population download the data, download the app in New Zealand. It's just the app is clunky and is not being used, but that level of trust is there.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Eric.
Yes.
I mean, upon further reflection, what Rosa said, I have a question for Rosa. Has there been a role, or do you see perhaps a role for the use of data from telecommunication company for the prevention of COVID, to trace infections or etc.? And what are the related privacy challenges in your view?
Yeah, Georg, that's an interesting question, because in Europe there have been some attempts to use telecommunication data. Today, some of the speakers have called for how this information might be very useful. Perhaps an element to remember is that the use of traffic data, metadata, content data is extremely regulated. I think I would say as much as under the GDPR, but there is another law, which is the law of privacy in telecommunications. Telecommunications, the traditional ones, and now very soon also encompassing the so-called number-independent communication services, the so-called OTTs. So this legislation today puts severe limits on what telecommunications can do with the traffic data. So it's not because the traffic data might be useful that they might get the traffic data and use the traffic data for purposes. The law does not prevent to use it, but there must be a framework authorizing the companies to use this data unless it's anonymized. So some member states we have seen that have developed national legislation which would basically allow the telephone companies to use the data without being fully anonymized, but still up to a convenient point where it's sort of safe so that it can be used for COVID. But I guess that what it boils down is that in Europe, to do so, it requires national laws that set basically for the checks and balances as to how to use the data. Obviously, if it's completely anonymous, and here is a very important point because there is a lot of discussion of what is anonymizing. If data is fully anonymized, it can be used without any problem, but it must be anonymized.
Maybe if you allow, I would also expand this question to Christian Fritsch, because he was heavily involved in an application to use anonymized data, and I can imagine that a lot of issues came up, whether it's truly anonymized or only pseudonymized or whatsoever. Christian, can you say something about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were discussing this up and forth during several institutions and also discussions with lawyers and all the regulatory bodies in Austria. The situation is quite challenging in a sense that on the one hand side, you have the business ratio and also the business case demanding the data and the insights. On the other hand, you have like the user data that is like producing the location information. And we were coming to the point that because of using not any app or any piece of the software on the mobile phone, but only to use the network information in terms of the traffic exchanges of the messages between antenna sites and central stations, we were able to say that the information in the spatial and time-wise system is that much inaccurate. Therefore, you can't say that, for example, you have the real position of the smartphone because you only know that it's somewhere within a cell. And then by aggregating this information even further, we were able to say that we have more or less lost the accurate information regarding the temporal spatial information. And therefore, it was treated as completely anonymized because you were not able, and that was also declared from our consultants, that you're not able to get from that information back to the individual. And that was the saying that we always tried to put in place once we stated clearly that the use of such information is based on entirely anonymized like data sets. But you're absolutely right. I think that this will come to a discussion. Why? Because there is some more value once you would be able to really use the data in like health system environments, but then it has to come by a regulation or any like kind of a legal act to allow a network operator to use and also to monetize somehow this work. Because actually it really needs a lot of work. It's like really heavy man hours and months to come to actively work on the data sets and to analyze the information, and also to present the insights and the dashboards and everything that will then be created for them.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. I've heard that we have a couple of more questions coming from the audience. Eric,
Yes.
you're taking care of that.
Yes. Now there was a follow-up question from Derek Oldenburg, really to Scott's question regarding whether there were any sort of R figure that could be, sampled from these apps. But I suppose you already answered no. Essentially, is anybody aware of these that you can really use? I can allow if Derek wants to restate the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Well, so I've listened to the contribution very carefully, and basically successful systems, successful apps in sort of general assessment is that it is decentral and it is voluntary. But if the uptake in a well-organized country like Austria, for example, is 15%, which is on the basis of voluntary downloading, then what would be a method to measure the success of this digital application to help battle the virus? So because there are many policymakers nowadays look for digital, quote unquote, as a solution to a problem. And the question arises, this is a crisis. Several attempts have been made to develop apps that can really make an impact. And does it actually do is one question, but what method would be useful to measure the effectiveness of this?
Okay, is anybody willing to, if we take one answer per question now, at least we can have the chance.
I can try to answer.
Yes.
One thing that we can measure with the app is the number of persons that the app has identified as a contact who tested positive later on. That would give you an indication of the effectiveness of the app on identifying contaminated people. So for example, yes, the number of people who tested positive later on identified with the app. That could be an indicator of effectiveness, for example.
Okay.
Okay. So another question been raised by Henri van der Spuy. If you want to restate your question.
Hi, thank you. So just firstly, I'm glad to hear that so many of you have said that and reiterated that technology is not a silver bullet. And that kind of ties me to the question that I had, which was more specifically about the global south or developing countries where you have very low levels of both internet access and smartphone adoption, and what you do in those contexts. So you have both the barrier of low levels of access, and the second barrier is that you don't have data protection frameworks in place like the GDPR that was spoken about quite a lot. And one suggestion that's been made in at least some of those contexts is that you can think of zero rating both the apps and the download of the apps. And at least in those contexts where the concern is more high data costs, you can overcome and get people to download the app more. I'm just touching on what the previous intervention was asking about download rates. I was wondering whether that's a solution or a potential response in the markets that you've mentioned, or whether that's more of a global south issue, whether privacy is a primary reason in the global north for not downloading, whereas costs seem to be a significant reason for not downloading in the global south. Efficiency of the app and the low levels of connectivity aside. Thank you.
Is anybody? Yes, please.
I could talk.
Yes, please.
I think I touched on that a little bit in my 3 minutes that Georg gave me in the last go round. It's a great question. Yeah, you know, we're having a debate about in a world where people have $2,000 phones, and this isn't going to work in this form in countries with limited smartphone adoption or smartphones that don't run the Apple, Google app, etc. And it may be, it's not a silver bullet as you repeated, and it may be that we just have to acknowledge that in those, you know, responses are country specific. As I said at the start, Canada's success, to the extent that we're successful, made no use of apps really meaningfully, made no use of hyperscale testing initially. And it may be that in some of these countries, you know, they have no other asset than social conformity and law enforcement, you know, strict lockdowns at this point. You know, maybe technology is not a hope yet in these countries with very limited smartphone adoption.
Well, thank you. Maybe Bronwyn is raising your hand, so please, brief comment.
I want to raise the point that in fact the smartphone apps had their first origin actually in Africa in the Ebola crisis. And that was where they were first developed, because the smartphones were seen as being a way of accessing a population in a different way. So I think maybe this is the developed world having learned something ultimately from what has happened in the developing countries.
Okay, thank you. Saber, Munir Saber has also raised a quite generic question, and also Mr. Takahiro Kawamata, two very quite big questions, but I will summarize, but maybe Munir or Saber, are you still? Yes, you're still there, so I let you talk. Can you speak, Saber? Okay, he's not there. It's about a very broad question about ensure fairness and ethics in data use. And that's a topic we have touched upon indirectly in a lot of contexts. And also the comment from Takahiro Kawamata, I read it out loud. Thank you for the invitation to the webinar. The problem with the tracking app is about the right to control data. Even in Japan, where there is not enough understanding and consensus, political initiatives are required, but the government's data control is reliable. Whether or not it can be done, the corona response of Asian countries is a strong reflection of the political system over this public and private control right and trust in government. I would appreciate if you could comment on this point. So I think it's a very generic point about the political systems. And I think that's kind of a concluding comment if anybody wants to add something there as well. I saw Stephen Schmidt nodding, so no.
I'm just agreement. I have nothing more to add really. I'm in agreement.
Okay, I think we are toward we're 15:59 if you have this calculated European time. It was great to listen to all of you and to have so much experience to bring forth here. Thank you for all the well-prepared slides. Thank you for the audience for raising interesting questions and being with us for a long time. Thank you, Georg, who initiated this. really great, fabulous, very insightful, absolutely great. So even I say great, maybe bite my tongue because it's such a serious topic. But anyway, we have to have ideas about our very big current crisis. So great in that context that we are struggling in a very serious issue. So I think we are ready to conclude. In fact, and as you may have noticed, have been live streamed on YouTube. We will open up the link, or it's open, but we will distribute the link later. So we appreciate that we can follow up this in perhaps classes or in other contexts as well. So with this, I'll just say great thanks to all of you. And if there's nothing more, no last minute things, will end the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.